Good to be here. Good to be here again.
That's right.
Yeah. And, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself first and some of the points that we want to cover. And then we'll engage in conversation, and then we'll take your questions, comments, critiques, and we'll go from there. So my family fled persecution from Iraq in the early 60s. My dad was actually on the execution list by the military government there in 1963. He went in and out of jails for quite some time. And I did not even know my dad because he had left, and we stayed with my grandparents. And then my mom took 3 kids. She was 20 at the time with 3 kids.
Mm.
So, being uprooted, you can imagine a 20-year-old leaving a country for a strange place called America, and then being pretty much on her own for quite some time. But what was interesting about that is that we came to JFK. We flew in, and I was 4 at the time, and I saw a man who was looking at us, and I asked my mom, "Who's that?" She said, "That's your dad." And so it was that kind of experience that we had from the beginning. And I imagine a lot of families from the Middle East, from the region, had similar experiences, if not their own family, then a relative who was like that. And it turned out that at that time, the West had decided that they wanted to root out any communist influence. And so they supported the Arab nationalists led by Nasser at that time. And the Ba'ath Party was pretty much supported by the West. And that was the main reason why there was that coup in 63 against Abdul Karim al-Qasim. And the Ba'ath came into power sometime after that, and Saddam Hussein became vice president in the late 60s and became president in the early 70s. And we all know somewhat of the history, after that point. Fast forward to 1990, we made Hajj. I was on Hajj with my family, my parents, my wife, and my siblings. And my mom decided that she wanted to visit Iraq after Hajj, and that was in the August of 1990, which is the date of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, after he was told by April Gillespie, the U.S. ambassador, that the United States would not intervene or would not. I don't know the exact words, but basically he thought it was the green light, that he can go ahead. He wouldn't deal with any repercussions from the United States. And lo and behold, that was the beginning of Operation Desert Shield. And my mom was stuck in Iraq for quite some time, and came home just before the United States launched airstrikes in January of 91. And so that was the first Gulf War. And so we're not unfamiliar, unfortunately, with war in the region. And from, that leads to my 3 points. The history of war in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, for that matter. Number 2, the opposition to the governments there, and most of it led by Islamic groups, what the makeup is, what they stand for, what their short falls are, and where to go from here, where it goes from here. And then number 3, American Muslim communities and how they've dealt with these situations. And obviously a lot of it that you're probably familiar with is after 9/11 and post 9/11 policies, but this all started way before 9/11. This is not, to me, this is not a 9/11 phenomenon. This has been a phenomenon for quite some time, since the United States became a superpower after World War II, and basically inherited the legacy of the British and the French. So in terms of war in the region, one of my favorite books is written by David Fromkin, who wrote a Peace to End All Peace, the making of the modern Middle East. And that was basically a history overview of World War I and what happened after World War I when the Ottomans basically were receding in power. They were receding for quite some time, but it culminated during World War I, and the Arabs had made a deal with the British and the French that they would oppose the Ottomans and then gain their independence. And lo and behold, they did not get that independence. You can watch Lawrence Arabia and get the short version, the abridged version of that. But what came of that was the Sykes-Pico Agreement. Sykes being a British foreign desk officer, and Pico the French, and they just divided the Middle East in certain sections. And so the Hashemites, who had controlled Mecca at the time and most of the Arabian Peninsula, were basically moved out from there and were given a kingdom called Jordan, or Transjordan at the time. So Transjordan was really nothing before then. Right now, it's mostly populated by Palestinians, but the Hashemites were sent to Jordan, and one family member was sent to Jordan. The other one became the king of Iraq. So the Hashemites controlled both Iraq and Jordan at the time. The other interesting development from Sykes-Picot was that Syria and Lebanon, for that matter, were under French mandate, and Palestine was under British mandate. And we all know the history of Palestine. What happened after that was partition through the League of Nations, which later became the United Nations. So that basically has been the problem with the setup of the Middle East. And fast forward to 1952, when the Iranian people had democratically elected Mohammad Mossadegh, but the United States decided that he was not serving their purpose because he wanted to nationalize the oil fields. And so there was a CIA coup against him, led by, I believe, the grandfather of General Schwarzkopf, who engineered the first Gulf War. And the Shah was reinstated. There was the Pahlavi dynasty before then, and the Pahlavi dynasty was reinstated after 52, and then led to the Islamic Revolution of 79. And 79 was actually my entry into politics. I was a student at UCLA, and my first entry into politics was not the Middle East, it was actually Latin America. I became involved with a group called Committee in Solidarity of the People of El Salvador. There was the Iran-Contra affair later on, but the people of El Salvador were suffering from a right-wing government that was supported by the United States because of their opposition to communism, in particular the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. But I had that appeal. It appealed to me, what Latin America was going through, because if you look at Latin America and its history, it was very similar to the Middle East. Tyrants set up by Western powers, and given support and power, given basically arms and money, because they serve geopolitical interests. And so this is very, very abridged version. So if you're more interested, come to the course. But the major flaw that I see in our foreign policy is the national security system. I don't think that we have a military industrial complex. I think it's transformed into a national security industrial complex. And even when you think about what happened to Japanese Americans after World War II, there was that case, I forgot his name, the Supreme Court, Korematsu, thank you, Korematsu. And the Korematsu case was filed in the Supreme Court, and the United States, all they had to do was utter 2 words, and they were given the green light by the Supreme Court. They said, well, we had to do it for national security reasons. And so anytime the US government says it's for national security, they basically are given license to do pretty much whatever they want to do, whether it's intern people, deport people, detain people, create Guantanamo, so on and so forth. And so it's a flawed national security system. And I say it's flawed not just because of what happens to us in terms of civil liberties, but I say it because it does not really serve American interests. If you look to what happened in Afghanistan, in the war in Afghanistan, it was done for national security purposes, even though it did not require an all-out war to eliminate al-Qaeda. It could have been done with special forces. We did not need to go to war in Iraq. It had nothing to do with 9/11. The United States actually lied about Iraq's involvement with 9/11. There was no involvement. It lied about chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction. There were none. And even though we despised Saddam, we knew that war in Iraq would create a worse situation, which we're suffering from, not just in terms of Iraqi people, but the world is suffering from that problem there. But the national security system at this time is flawed because it singles out Islam as the major threat. And so if you find Islamic militants, you go to war. You create clandestine operations. You do whatever you have to do because they are the threat. Hindu militants, not so much. Jewish militants, we'll deal with them later. Christian militants, yeah, they're part of us. They're not part of them. So we'll manage them somehow, some way. But Islamic militants, it's in existential threats. And unfortunately, 9/11 just, gave that narrative, even though it was done by 19 people. It just provided that narrative that Islam was the threat. And we've had to deal with the ins and outs of the national security system. And I ask people, I said, we spend about $1 trillion a year in national security. Do we feel more secure from that? And the answer is no. We are not secure because we have not dealt with the root cause of the problems of the Middle East or of South Asia or North Africa for that matter. And we can get to that later. The second issue is we've seen throughout the region Islamic opposition to tyrants in the Middle East. Some of them have been effective. Most of them have failed. The worst failure is the Iranian government's, the Mullah regime that we all, in 1978 and 79, there was that enthusiasm, there was that great excitement that, okay, what actually was a non-violent people's revolution in Iran. And it led to the winds of change in Europe. But when it comes to a people's revolution in one area, it's met with resistance, i.e. the MENASA region. Yeah. In another region, such as Europe, it's met with support, and it leads to this double standard. And the double standard can't be seen more than it is in Ukraine vis-a-vis Palestine. The same words that we use for the Ukraine, we will not support forced acquisition of land. We will not support these crimes against humanity. We will not support all these things in Ukraine. The same things are happening to the Palestinian people, but we turn a blind eye, or we actually finance what's happening to the Palestinian people. Then we wonder why there's anti-American sentiment in the region. But the Islamic opposition in the region started actually, in terms of the modern era, with the Ikhwan in the 30s, led by a man named Hassan al-Banna, who actually was more of a reformist than he was a revolutionary. And in his reform, he wanted to bring back Islam as a relevant factor in people's lives, because he felt, like many people, Muslims do, feel that Islam really is what made the Muslim world. It made a civilization. And to this day, we don't understand what impact Islam had on civilization. Like, I grew up in Arizona. In my textbooks, the only part, it went from Roman and Greek civilization, and then the Dark Ages, and then modern Western civilization. The Dark Ages was really the Islamic civilization. It's just that Europe went through the Dark Ages while the Middle East was going through its peak in terms of culture and arts and sciences and so on and so forth. So we've always had that blind spot in terms of, where does Islam fit? So many Muslim reformers wanted to bring back Islam to relevance, and Hassan al-Banna did that. Although he also had a wing that dealt with the British colonization of Egypt at that time, that had confrontations, and that led to basically his assassination by the British. and he died at a very young age, if not late 30s, early 40s, I believe, very young age. But he led a movement that to this day we are dealing with its reverberations. And
Muslim Brotherhood.
the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah.
And Al-Qaeda is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not really, I wouldn't say that it came from the Muslim Brotherhood, but one member, Zawahiri, was a member of that, and then he left and formed Al-Qaeda with Osama bin Laden. But other groups that do social services, build hospitals, deal with relief are also part of the Muslim Brotherhood. So you find the array of various Islamic groups that came from the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Hezbollah, a lot of the Islamic groups, such as Islamic groups in Turkey now, and other parts. Jamaat Islami is the main group that we would consider to be that group led by Maududi in South Asia. So a lot of these Islamic groups were basically set up as opposition to the status quo, i.e. the dictators in the region, as well as Western intervention, interference, and colonialism in the region. And most of them, in our opinion, have failed in terms of learning how to represent all people. They represent an ideological strain, which tends to be ones that they impose, as opposed to ones that are developed within society. And much of that is because they've had to carry a militant overtone in terms of their work, but the politics of them is still, the jury is still out in terms of where they will land in the near future. There's still a lot of support for them by people, although there's probably less and less support because they're representing fewer and fewer groups in the region. But we'll discuss that more later. Then the third aspect of it is the American Muslim community. I was involved in 1986, actually. I was involved in a case called the LA8.
Yeah.
You remember that?
Yeah.
Right. So the LA8 was actually centered in Los Angeles. The LA8 was 8 Palestinians and a Kenyan woman, who was, I think, wife of one of the Palestinians, that were arrested based on actually a McCarthy era law called the Mccarran-Walter Act. And that was basically, if you're part of a communist party, you cannot distribute literature for the Communist Party. And so these were members of the PFLP, the People's Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was a Marxist group, and or leaned Marxist. And so they were in America. They were asylees. They were supporting the Palestinian cause, and they were distributing literature. And so the government detained them per the Mccarran-Walter Act. It took a lot of effort by members of the city council, ACLU, a lot of famous civil rights people whom I can't remember at this time.
Yeah.
Dan Stormer. You remember him?
So, yeah.
Yep. So he led the
another
case.
big lawyer. I
Yeah.
can't remember.
So
Yeah.
these are big time lawyers that we
Yeah.
brought in, and we overturned the case. But what we found out from that is that the United States was preparing a test for internment camps in Oakdale, Louisiana. If these people were going to be convicted, then they would be sent to Louisiana in a detention camp. And if that succeeded, then that would be precedent to do more of the same with others. So this idea of internment camps and post 9/11 stuff, as I said, predated 9/11. This was already, according to, to some people within the government as well in the civil rights community, this dated back to the 70s and 80s. There was also, the use of, anyway, I'll talk about that later, the ADC. So American Muslims and Arab Americans have been at the forefront of opposition to the policies of the United States and the Middle East, and have paid the price for a lot of them. what we're saying now is the national security policy is flawed. And you do not use American Muslims as part of your foreign policy making apparatus. It's usually done by powerful lobbies and contractors. Defense Department. The Defense Department, in my opinion, is the largest PR firm in the country. If you go to Washington, you will see Pentagon people walking in and out of offices. They're lobbying. And if you watch CNN, I don't know, all one of us probably still watches CNN. But if you watch CNN or some of these cable network shows, what do they usually get for a commentator? Military person or a former national security advisor, former general, 5-star general. Tell us what's happening. What are you doing? So it's like playing these battleship games, and you're letting them be the commentators. So they're controlling the narrative. What we're saying now is that national security has failed us. And what we need to do is pivot from national security to human security. Human security is basically speaking to the security of civilian populations, not geopolitical interests. And Afghanistan is exhibit A. We went to Afghanistan and we supported government after government that did not really have the support of the people. Why did we support those governments? Why did we install those governments? Because they served geopolitical interests vis-a-vis Pakistan, vis-a-vis India, vis-a-vis maybe even China or Russia, what have you. But they served certain geopolitical interests as far as the United States government was concerned towards those other countries, and did not really serve the people's interests, the civilian interests. Well, human security basically talks about 4 freedoms. And this was developed by FDR. FDR did one great thing, human security, and a lot of other good things. Did one terrible thing, and that was Executive Order 9066, which was the internment of Japanese Americans. But he did make a speech before the invasion, before the attack on Pearl Harbor, back in February of 1941, where he laid out 4 freedoms. He gave a speech about 4 freedoms. And those 4 freedoms comprised human security. And they were freedom of worship, freedom of expression, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And we all know freedom of worship is religious freedom, the right to worship as you see fit, however you see fit. And the right basically of religious minorities in any country. Freedom of expression, to speak out as your conscience as you wish. Freedom from want is economic security, the right to housing, the right to education, the right to all the necessities of living a basic needs in life. And then freedom from fear is not to be intimidated by your own government, or not to be living in war. So these are the 4 freedoms of human security. That's what we need now in terms of reforming, if not replacing, our current national security policy. It's an audacious goal, but if it's not audacious, it's not worth it. But that's what we see as part of the answer towards resolving the problems in the Middle East, which includes serving American interests. And going back to Afghanistan, after 20 years of funneling money and supporting contractors to set up that house of cards, once we ran out of funds, it fell like a house of cards. And the same thing is going to happen throughout the Middle East. And the basic fear of the United States is we don't know, we'd rather deal with the devil we know than the devil we don't know. But that in and of itself is a fallacy. There are people's interests. We are not on the side of their interests at that time, at this time. And unless we engage in human security, and if we just continue with the same status quo national security policy, then there will be more war, and there will be more civil rights issues here. And we'll be talking about civil rights, but that's really a symptom of the problem. We've got to deal with the root cause of it, and that's the policy itself.
Okay, so let's start. So do you have any, you want to start with any thoughts you might have? Can I turn that towards you?
Well, thank you. This is more of a personal question for you. Because I know that you were just named to the faith-based advisory
Mhm.
council for Homeland Security. And just, was that hard for you to accept that position, given how you feel about the national security apparatus? Like, how do you weigh those
Right.
things?
It was harder when I was appointed under Trump. But under Trump, the threat of so, the national security experts have all determined that white supremacy is really the current national security threat, white supremacist violence. And so at that time, we had talked about, reforming our counterterrorism policy to address that. And so I needed to serve on the Faith-Based Advisory Council to come up with recommendations on protecting houses of worship, and that trumped over our concerns for Trump. So I served there. Serving now is a lot easier. And as I said in my talk, you have to engage in national security. You have to be experts in national security to pivot the policy towards human security. To come from the outside and say it's all wrong, I think that's fine, but I feel like it's more effective to work on it from within.
Mhm.
And that's why, and this is really, to be quite frank, it's not really addressing policy issues. It's addressing the threats to faith communities right now, namely threats by white supremacists against Black churches, synagogues, and dealing with the Great Replacement conspiracy theory that started in France by somebody who said that Muslims in France, the French, the Algerians, and the Moroccans are going, the immigration is going to continue to the point that they will replace white people, and there's a white genocide in Europe, and so it transferred to the United States, but it focuses on Jews and Blacks. That Jews are financing people of color to replace whites, either immigrants like Muslims, immigrants or Latinos, or Blacks here to replace whites. So that is the major threat, and that's why I serve on this council.
You guys ever run into the Great Replacement stuff? It's significantly entrenched at this point.
Yeah.
It's like it's fundamental to our politics now.
Yeah.
I would say
It's mainstreamed, unfortunately, through media like Fox News, where that's the narrative. And the Republican Party, for that matter, or parts of the Republican Party. So that's the number one threat to us. And when there's that threat, then yeah, you put politics aside, you go in and you do what you can to at least secure the community from this threat.
Yeah, sort of raises the immigrant. So when the immigration was a discussion of like cultural dilution, the remedies were not as drastic as they are now, like the called for remedies for immigration. But this raises it to like genocide. It turns immigration into a form of genocide,
Right.
Which then like justifies greater and greater violence in a way that know that you can talk about at the political level rather than just on web forums or I guess in newsletters back in the day.
Yeah, and that leads them to think that we're either a nuisance or a threat.
Yeah,
but we're not part of this society. Even though I've been here almost 60 years now, my family's been here almost 60 years, and my kids are, growing up here. We're not part of America. We don't belong.
Yeah. So I'll just ask one question, and we can open it up to questions here. So mine is to go back to the role that American national security policy, going back to when, like, let's just pick, maybe World War I is a good time to pick, the Sykes-Pico agreement, in generating, like transforming Islam, at least, certain expressions of Islam in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, Pakistan, or Iran, so on. Just say a bit more about that dynamic.
Yeah, so at that time, the Islamic opposition to imperialism was more at the local level.
Yeah.
And so there were religious leaders that at that time declared jihad against British colonialism. And that was a jihad of defense, not offensive jihad, but a defensive jihad, which is a struggle against invasion of their countries. And so the British failed in certain parts because of that opposition. But it did not form into any national or international movement until much, much later. Probably I would say the 40s or the 50s, and then did not culminate until I would say the 70s and 80s, where it was adopted by the masses. And so you would notice that more women would don the headscarf in the 80s. They did not do so in the 70s.
In the region.
In the region,
Yeah.
and here as well.
Yeah.
So that's just one expression of it. It's a superficial one, but that's what we see. And Islamic political groups were developing, some of their political thinking at the time, and to this day, I would say that they've still not met the standards of governance, if you will. Like if they were given power, I believe they would fail, just like the Iranian government is failing. Yeah. And the problem for us is that once a religious group is identified as the government, then opposition to them means opposition to religion, and then the people end up resenting Islam, which is what's happening in Iran. Is that when you find pockets of Iranian communities here, they blame Islam for it. So it's a very tricky situation for us as far as the political Islamic movements, where they've come. The most successful was actually in Tunisia, and even now, they've been excluded from ruling in that region.
Yeah. It's a very complex dynamic, right?
Yeah,
So,
and then of course what happened in Egypt,
Yeah.
in the Arab Spring, is that the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, were given power, and within months, again, they failed the people, and the people turned against them, and the military used that to lead a coup against them.
so the imbrication of politics and religion,
The what?
the intertwining of politics and religion, the imbrication of them, often doesn't get noticed. So it's like politics versus religion takes over politics, but it's shaping and transforming expressions.
It's shaping, yes. I mean, classical Islamic jurisprudence, what's interesting about that, when you look at Islamic states, they were not religious. The Ottomans were not necessarily religious power, but they had ulama, the scholars, that acted more or less as an independent judiciary. So you had the political, the siyasa,
Right.
which was the authority, the political authority, and then the fuqaha, the jurists, were separate from the political. And that's really where you find a contradiction of many modern Islamic groups, because they want to conflate the two. And that's what Iran did, which was very strange for Shia political theory, because Shia political theory was always with the people, always part of the opposition, never part of the political authority. So once they became not only part of the political authority, the sole political authority, then failure was its destiny.
Yeah, great books there. That's great. So how about we just open it up and ask questions that you could think of, or anything you want to know about MPAC's work as well, and we can just weave in more specific, sort of policy questions and intellectual questions. Don't be shy. Yeah.
So in terms of when we talked about how England or I guess the West is trying to manipulate the countries in the East through like government changes or just funding the right people, like the right people. How about like the Islamic theology? How was that effective? And because we see a lot of civil wars happening in those Middle Eastern countries, obviously sometimes because of the political regime, but also at times because their beliefs might not be in the same place. So I just comment on that.
Yeah. My short answer to that is most of those conflicts start as political, and then the religious element gets injected later. So, a lot of these conflicts that we're talking about, like in Iraq, for example, it's the Shia that are in the south mainly, and the Kurds are in the north. And the United States, from the outset, said we're going to look at Iraq as three different parts, and we'll manage them. And the Kurds were practically given an independent state. They still, have a lot of sovereignty, and so that division led to that sort of ethnic and religious division as a result. There has been sectarianism, throughout history, and it exists through this day. And so you find a lot of anti-Shia rhetoric throughout the Gulf by Salaf, by Wahhabis. But you also have Sunni, if you will, rhetoric as it relates to what's happening to the Syrian people by pro-Iranian groups. So you do have part of that. So internally, yes, there are. You can put the responsibility on these internal rifts as well, but they usually start out as political or as power grabs, and then a person will use or invoke some sectarianism as a result. Yeah, go ahead.
So another question that I had was in terms of, because when you were talking about, I think, forgot which country we're talking about, when you were trying to describe like how a lot of the things that were happening in the Middle East, that this kind of like got related to Islam. Anything that was happening in the Middle East, people American policy started targeting Muslim people rather than like, if there is, a problematic group, but rather than like, they looked at the whole belief as the problem.
Right.
Where did that start?
Well, I think Malik can answer that. Clash of
The
Civilization.
year 820, for real. Goes back to the 9th or 10th century.
Yeah.
The formation of Christian and Western identity in opposition to Islam is the dominant, like the growing dominant cultural force is how.
Yeah, and the Middle East and Europe were at war up until World War I, whether it's the Turks at the walls of Vienna, or the ethnic cleansing of Turkic people throughout the Balkans, and the dismantlement of the Ottoman Empire. What happened after that. So there's always been that conflict between Europe and the Middle East. Europe taking on the Christian flag, and Middle East the Islamic, and that has spread obviously to the United States as a result.
There's an argument to be made that the West's identity going into the Middle Ages and then into the early modern period is built entirely in opposition to Islam and the Islamic West, right? So,
and the term Judeo-Christian was just added later, just to say, hey, the Jews are on our side, because what does Judeo-Christian mean? Like it doesn't mean anything. It's if you want to talk about commonality of faith, we call it Abrahamic. If you're a follower of Abraham, I think that has to include Muslim. It's Muslim, Christian, and Jew. But they use that Judeo-Christian term as a wedge to further divide the West from the Middle East.
Obviously, like with like anti-Islamic sentiment, rooted in the idea of the West, and also at the same time talking about how the golden age of Islam is actually portrayed as the dark ages for the world, because
For Europe.
yeah, that's right.
And we're Eurocentric, right?
yeah. And so in that terms, like Islam has always been seen as a problem.
Right.
But has there been research that Islam could actually be a solution to a lot of the problems, civil problems, or any of the problems that we're
Well, I mean, we can't say it's a solution until we see solutions by these Islamic groups, which we haven't yet. But having said that, I think just nursing a young person on this idea that either Islam was part of the dark ages, or as I read in my seventh grade textbook, it was Arab warriors that like Islam was spread by the sword. That was the mentality that we had about Islamic civilization. That's all you learned from that textbook. Then of course you grow up thinking that these people are a problem. You have to go to college and study Islamic civilization to really get an appreciation for these kind of advancements. that the Islamic civilization made at that time. And even Muslims, I would say, suffer from a loss of that legacy. And so when we think, oh, we want Islam, what does that mean? Okay, halal food, build a mosque, do things. No, it's more than that. So if we want to talk about solutions, it's not just about give us the rule on, whether I can eat at In-N-Out or not. Exactly. Of course I'm gonna eat it In-N-Out. I will make it halal. So you just get stuck in that vortex of halal haram, as opposed to, hey, Islam really helped Western civilization in terms of, when we say the Arabic numeral system, where'd that come from? The Muslims. It's called Arabic numeral for a reason. And so people don't really, it's not a direct connection to Islam, but that was part of the solution, is that there was an advancement in math and the sciences and so many other things. And of course, you find today many Muslims who are continuing to lead in the sciences and in so many other areas. So yeah, putting that narrative out there would be part of the solution.
So yeah.
I'm interested in hearing more about these Middle Eastern groups, especially Persians in America, and how you're mentioning how some groups, they have negative views towards Islam, and like, especially in the context of being living in America and many of the people growing up in America, how they formulate those views towards,
Yeah.
like,
Well, in short, what it is an ideology of compulsion that many of these Islamic political groups represent and enforce. And the idea of a morality police, for example, in many Islamic countries is part of the problem. In Islam, in the Quran, it says very, very clearly, there shall be no compulsion in matters of faith. And also it says, indeed, we have bestowed dignity on humanity. So human dignity is a cornerstone of Islamic thought. None of that is represented in these Islamic political groups. When you go tell a 7-year-old girl that if she's not covered this way or that way, she's going to hell, and that she has to, or a man and a woman can't be talking in public, and most of it is dealing with women, these morality police. It's the weaponization and criminalization of women's rights that's the problem in many of these countries. And so people, or you can't have cable in
Satellite dishes.
Because they want to control the narrative. They want to control what people are thinking. So that is an anathema to Islam. It's not found in the Quran or in the Sunnah, which is the authenticated traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. It was just the opposite. When you read about the history of the Prophet and his companions, he was a sign of mercy. He's what we call a sign of mercy to humanity, to everybody. So this notion that these groups feel like they have to impose Islam because their job is to make Muslims better Muslims and to make other people become Muslims, that is a violation of Islam. It's the same thing that we're doing in the West, where we're going to Afghanistan, putting a gun to people's head and say, we want you to have democracy. That's what they're doing in Iran, where they're putting a gun to people's head and say, you have to be a Muslim. So as a result, when people see that, oh, this government represents Islam and that's all they know, then of course they will become apostates, they will become dissidents, they will oppose the government, and by definition, they will oppose Islam. So we cannot blame them for having this antipathy towards Islam. It's very understandable. And it comes from this idea that these groups have to form a morality police. The idea of morality police is also interesting because it comes from a verse in the Quran that the believers are those who enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. That is meant to be people working for virtue, for human dignity, for freedom, for decency. And virtue is what's developed in organic form through people interacting with people in a modest way, in a decent way, and doing good, things like that. It is not meant for a government to say, I'm going to form a committee to make sure that you have virtue. That simply means you're trying to control people. So that's what the governments did. They bastardized this verse, and they used it for their political purpose and weaponized it to really suppress people. And as a result, people see that Islam does not mean freedom. They think it's the opposite of freedom. It's anti-freedom. Does that explain?
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting because, the people, observe
Yeah.
as a whole thing.
And even now in the Gulf, I think people are becoming less and less religious because of that imposition of morality police.
Okay, so we've got only a few minutes left, so go ahead.
Yeah, so.
You have a question there too? Or?
Oh, hold on. Yeah, hold on. Let me just 1 second. Let me just see what this is. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so the question I wanted to ask is, basically like, so I've thought about this a lot, so, I mean, I'm not gonna name names, but like, I know a lot of like ex-Muslims in my entire family's Islamic, so I mean, it's kind of like been preached to the choir, but,
You should
so-
probably teach the class.
That's right.
No, but it's basically, so I think one of the recently, I mean, during these protests, I've been just like avidly trying to listen to the Supreme Leader's speeches, for like from like the last 5 years, because I really want to just understand his train of thought and basically like what forms this guy's worldview. Because he just seems like a very weird figure that not even like Iran would know about. But anyway, and then recently I learned about how he gave a speech in which he said like, oh yeah, like offhandedly, oh yeah, there are even many like supporters of the revolution who don't wear the hijab. And it's just really weird that he would say that, like, in the middle of all this, like it's almost as if he's like, he really wants to get in, but people get muted, obviously. But my question basically is the problem with these governments is that they're basically like, and I think this is already well iterated, they're basically like claiming to be like the bastions, like the Vaticans of Islam, both Iran and Saudi Arabia, and therefore anyone who like opposes them is literally an enemy of God.
Correct.
Right.
That is the point.
And so basically it's really weird because I just wanted to get your view on like what do you think is actually a realistic government for places like Iran, and because the secular thing has been tried and it's just not worked out, and now you have this kind of theocratic thing
Right.
in opposition to that, and that's just even like 10 times worse.
Right.
But if you go back to the way things were, in the time of the Shah completely, then there's still going to be so much of the Iranian population that's going to also be against that. So,
Okay.
what is like real?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just comment on this idea of, how did these Islamic groups become the way they are today?
Yeah.
One of the reasons they are the way they are is that they developed as anti-Western political movements. So whatever the West said, they by default took on the opposite position. Well, if that's Western, then the Islamic position is whatever is the anti-Western. If the West is talking about human rights, well, that's a secular, humanist, blah, blah, blah. No, we're about obeying God. And obeying God means you have to do this, this, and that. Population control, big issue, especially in many of these countries where poverty is really bad. And we're trying to, develop contraceptive methods and so on. No, they would not have any of it. And so they were against population control because that's a Western phenomenon. The West also doesn't do itself much of a favor because it ties government funds to certain social programs that are interfering with these countries. Namely sexuality, or favoring even a minority group. And once you're favored by the United States, that's sort of the kiss of death in those countries. So it creates more problems as a result. But its main problem, these Islamic political groups' main problem, and especially Iran, is that it's still, I think, is considering itself a revolutionary government, right? I mean, it's been 40 years, 43 years, and they're still talking about the revolution as if it just happened yesterday. But that's the problem. That's one major problem. So we have to press pause and say, well, what is Islam then? What does Islam say about women's rights, about rights of minorities, about political violence, about all these things, and have discourse on that issue internally about that to develop these stands. So I would say in the short term, you have to reverse, which you cannot. I don't know if they can in Iran, the Velayat al-Faqih, that the authority of the jurist, that only the jurist can be the ruler in that state, because that is a theocracy. Even though it is a democratic in terms of elections, it's a theodemocracy in Iran. That has to change. When it will change, I don't know, because it really is up to the people. The United States, best thing it can do is just stay out of it. And not, when they talk about sanctions against Iran, who does that hurt? Hurts the people. Doesn't hurt the mullahs. Doesn't hurt the regime. Same thing happened in Iraq throughout the 90s. It really, it crushed the people. So I would say that the short term is you get these Islamic, you allow Islamic political movements to develop, to organize, but under a pluralistic political system. In other words, it's a political party like any other party. It cannot be the only party, cannot be the dominant party, but can be one of many, and let the people decide what they want. And it can be voted out as fast as it can be voted in. In other words, if people like it because it uses the cloak of Islam and Islam gains popularity, okay, but once it's in power and it fails, the people can vote it out as fast as it would. The problem with many of these groups is that they believe that they can come in, and then after that, then it's forbidden for them to be elected out, because again, they believe that they represent God on earth, and you can't oppose God. So there's a long ways to go, but maybe that idea of a political pluralistic movement, or as with what happened in Tunisia, the Nahda, the Renaissance movement, the Islamic group there, took itself out of rule and became more part of the constitutional process in that country.
The reaction formation to Western power. So that's what in around like Shah's reign was. It's like the classic.
It's probably, and it's also not fair to consider the Shah to be
the
secular, because he was a tyrant. He was a secular tyrant.
So
So
sure your family knows.
there can be. I mean, to me, America is a perfect place for every religion, because we're committed to secularism, and it's about how you define secularism. And the European definition of secularism is anti-religion, whereas the American theoretical definition of secularism is being neutral on religion, that you cannot represent, you cannot sponsor one religion over others. That, I believe, is important for any government system to succeed in negotiating between religion and politics.
It's one of your positions, right? That American Muslims have the right political conditions to develop these new forms of
New thinking,
new thinking,
a new school of thought that we can form here as a Muslim minority. Which many of intellectual giants, I didn't think of it, but they came up with that idea, like Fethi Osman and many other great thinkers.